Hello there. Of the influences on the Jedi of Star Wars, many people talk about Taoism and Buddhism, but it's less often that we hear about Stoicism. Yet, Stoicism is one of the most important philosophies to cover. It is Stoic method and practice which will help us understand how it is that the Jedi could realistically gain mastery of their emotions in a way that is healthy and sustainable, even through the most difficult of times. Remember that Anakin's downfall, and even when we include the likes of Dooku, were very rare events. Most Jedi throughout the history of their order lived in accord with the Jedi principles their entire lives, even when having to engage in crises. They aren't on the brink, nor are they wringing their hands and bottling things up. They're portrayed to be a different kind of being that, thanks to their training, really does experience and react to the world differently than most people do. Many in the audience wonder how realistic that is and if it's practical. The history of the Stoics demonstrates that it can be. By Stoicism, what I mean is the ancient Greek philosophy that was founded by Zeno of Citium over 2,300 years ago in the 4th century BCE. It is one of the Socratic schools, meaning it was inspired by the earlier teachings of Socrates. This philosophy served as a major source of wisdom and ethics for people throughout the Greek world and the Roman Empire for several centuries. It was practiced by everyone from emperors to warriors to slaves. Modern Stoicism still exists. It has been influential in some psychological therapies and has been going through a bit of a rebirth in recent years. First, it's important to distinguish between the common word Stoic that people use every day and actual Stoicism. In casual usage, when people describe someone as Stoic, what they usually mean is that they're simply unemotional. But that's a mischaracterization of Stoicism. Ancient Stoics, like many of the Jedi in Star Wars, can be seen smiling, laughing, having friendships, being joyful, and even Master Yoda engages in playful silliness with younglings. What Stoicism is about is having healthy emotions. That means not being overcome by fear, anxiety, anger, sadness, and so on. It also means having greater joy and equanimity or peace in life. The Stoics used the word eudaimonia, which literally meant healthy soul, and that allowed for a flourishing life. But this kind of existence is not achieved merely by sheer willpower, or by pounding our heads and repeating to ourselves to stop it when we have those feelings. Nor can it be achieved by feeling guilty or shameful about our emotions, nor by suppressing or ignoring our feelings, which would be unhealthy and harmful. And it also cannot be achieved by faking it or by being dishonest with ourselves or others about our feelings. How this is achieved is the part that a movie doesn't have time to delve into, but we will delve into a little bit now. Stoicism is a complete life philosophy, meaning it is made up of an interdependent system of logic, physics, and ethics. Now, by logic, what I mean is a broad category of things that have to do with how we know what we know, or epistemology, as well as formal logic, as well as even mathematics, linguistics, semantics, and this sort of thing. And by physics, what I mean is the overall ideas about how the world works, and which would be like physics of today, but also just including all of the sciences about the world and about our place in it and about how everything functions. And then all of that was interdependent with Stoic ethics, which emerged out of those realizations in logic and physics. So the whole system was one integrated whole. So, Stoic physics. Many of the specifics and concepts in Stoic physics are outdated today. They might be called wrong, but really it's more that we simply know a lot more detail. We use different terms, and we have a lot more precision in physics today. The reason Stoic physics still serves as an important foundation is because, as a materialist view, most of its central essence is still at least analogous to our current scientific understanding of the world. Those core concepts include the following. First, the universe as seen by the Stoics is one integrated whole, not different realms or separate layers of reality or a natural and a supernatural. As Obi-Wan said, the Force binds the universe together. The Stoics said that all that is real consists of what exists, meaning bodies, or what we today might call particles or strings or whatever it ends up being, the fundamental building blocks of matter and energy. And the second thing that is real is that which subsists. That means it subsists on the relationships, patterns, and interactions between those bodies. Now, the Stoics referred to something called the Logos, which is basically the rational order by which all things unfold. Now, the Logos is a big deal because, especially in the ancient world, people may have wondered whether things happen because of the capriciousness of gods or because of randomness. As Obi-Wan said, there's no such thing as luck. The rational order by which the universe unfolds could also be called logic or fate or the laws of nature, or as we would call them today, the laws of physics. But this natural law of preceding causes, one leading to the next, as the explanation for how the universe operates, form the basis of Stoic physics and is still compatible with how science views the world today. Now, in the Stoic universe, it consists of the passive and the active. The passive was matter, and the active was that which animated it. These two were considered overlapping, with one flowing into the other all the time. The active elements form pneuma, which moves throughout the universe like air, or perhaps as the earlier influential philosopher Heraclitus described it, like the way kindling burns, but in a divine creative fire. Pneuma is a force that, as Obi-Wan says, surrounds us and penetrates us, binding us together. So, the active and the passive are somewhat analogous to our conception of matter and energy today. Some describe this active principle as the material explanation of God. Although the Stoic Zeus was not a separate entity, it was nature. It operated by those same laws and would be created or destroyed whenever the universe was created or destroyed. The Stoics believed that our own rational capacity was a spark of that divine fire. This is much like saying that our minds developed out of the same rational order and natural law that shapes how minds work and think. So, when we think about the physics behind our own will, it is not unlike the operations that move throughout the universe, which can be described as the will of the universe, what the Jedi call the will of the Force. All of this came out of Stoic logic, which contributed greatly to the fields of logic, linguistics, semantics, and more. And all of this brought about the conclusions of Stoic ethics, which is really more like what we call positive psychology today. That is, psychology that focuses on ways for humans to be healthier and happier. And this is where we get into what would be analogous with the connection between the nature of the Force and the Jedi philosophy and code. Here are some of the most impacting elements of Stoic ethics. As Qui-Gon Jinn says, your focus determines your reality. The Stoics, too, put a big emphasis on our focus, or the stories we tell ourselves. What we think and how we feel matters. How we frame things matters. how we categorize things, how we label things, what we call things, and how we judge them. We will face many hardships in life, but when we anguish about the hardships, we double them. We add on top of that even more suffering. And that's what the Stoics wanted to address. Shaping our subjective experience is what contemplative practice is all about, whether it be the Jedi Philosophy or Stoicism, Buddhism, what have you. Now, if we think about the way we think about things, that means we're going to have to pay attention to our language. And that means that there's a lot of terms in Stoicism. As you start to study it more and get into it, you'll find there's a lot of terms, and sometimes those terms are everyday common words, but if you understand them in their everyday common usage, you'll misunderstand Stoicism. And so it's important to pay attention to the technicality of these words, what they mean exactly and what they don't mean, and how these categories of concepts work. Because that will start to reshape your mind and how you perceive things and how you evaluate them. And that's where Stoicism begins. As Obi-Wan said, we must be mindful of our thoughts. The Stoics, too, are mindful of our thoughts, and the way they do that is by recognizing that all of our feelings arise out of a stimulus. We have a stimulus and a response. But, very importantly, between the stimulus and the response is judgment. So judgment is essential because at all moments, as we go through life, we're continuously judging. We're evaluating everything as good or bad, yes or no, aversion and desire, moving toward something, moving away from something. And as we make these judgments of good or bad, many times this happens microscopically, just instantaneously, and we don't even necessarily realize it. We're not always aware of the judgments we're making. So if we imagine this notion of stimulus followed by judgment, followed by response, then we see the origin of our feelings. Now the Stoics talked about pathos, which means a kind of sickness or illness, comes from the same root word as pathology. And what this referred to are unhealthy emotions, unhealthy feelings. They arise out of misjudgments. And all healthy feelings, or eupathe, arise out of true judgments. And this is why Qui-Gon wants us to think about what we are focusing on. Yoda admonishes Luke for not keeping his mind on where he is and what he's doing. Epictetus was a slave who became one of the most important Stoic masters. And he said, "When you are going about any action, remind yourself what the nature of the action is. If you are going to bathe, picture to yourself the things which usually happen in the bath. Some people splash the water, some push, some use abusive language, and others steal. Thus you will more safely go about this action if you say to yourself, 'I will now go bathe and keep my mind in a state comfortable to nature.' And in the same manner with regard to every other action." Through a practice of mindful meditation, one can learn how to maintain focus and awareness of one's inner thoughts and feelings before and during they arise, before they have time to grab hold of us. We can learn to widen that space between stimulus and response, so that moment of judgment isn't so microscopic. Obi-Wan said that the Force can control your actions, but also obey your commands. And that leads us to the next topic, which is control. The Stoics call this the dichotomy of control, and that means understanding what we do control and what we do not control. Now, what do the Stoics mean by control? We like to think that we have control over our lives, and we think about degrees of control in this or that. We think that we can control our career by doing certain things, working hard and taking the right steps to get promotions and so forth. And we imagine that we can control our health by eating right and exercising. And then we think about how we can control our wealth by investing or going out and getting the right job or training. And what the Stoics say is that we don't control any of this. We don't control our health, our wealth. We don't control our reputation. None of it. And the reason is because the Stoics don't deal in degrees of control the way people think about it today. And let me give you an example as to why. Imagine that you're working in an office and you get a promotion. And your boss tells you, you're in charge of this whole floor, this whole operation here, so do with it what you will and do a good job and make the company proud. So you think to yourself, oh, finally, we're going to do things the right way around here. And so you start sending out memos. You decide what kinds of things are going to change. You start making new rules, maybe getting rid of other ones, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you get a letter from your boss who's upstairs. And the letter says, you know that memo you put out changing that one policy? Yeah, we're going to have to not do that. You're going to have to rescind that. Oh, okay. You say, oh, okay. So you go and you change that. And then it happens again a little later and a little later. And then you come to realize that if you were to put all of these decisions in a column, and then you put another column where you marked every time the boss upstairs agreed with you or disagreed with you, what you would find is that the only things that happen are the things where the boss agree. And so your control that you thought you had was an illusion, because only when you agreed with the boss did the things actually take place. And that's what life is like. We have the universe and all of the other variables that go into the outcomes of things. The most powerful leader in the world with armies at their command could be killed one day because a peanut goes down the wrong hole when they swallow. There's always something that can happen that can override you. And that's why the Stoics say you don't really control those things. What you do control, the one thing you control, is your will. And by will, what they mean is your values, your judgments, and your choices. Ultimately, your character. And so what the Stoics do is draw a very sharp line between what you control and what you do not control, and try to stay aware of that at all times. They say there's no sense in getting upset or worried about something if it's outside your control, and if it's inside your control, there's no sense in getting upset or worried about it because you control it. But to do this requires a great deal of practice. As Yoda says, we must unlearn what we have learned. And so again, healthy feelings come from true judgments, and unhealthy feelings come from false judgments. And so the unhealthy feelings, which come from misjudgments, include distress, fear, greed, and delight. Distress being anger, disturbance, that sort of thing. Fear being anxiety and worry. Greed, they also call lust or desire. And delight is not easy to understand at first, but what it means is a kind of hedonism, a kind of enjoyment of something to the point where you're relishing it and becoming highly, highly attached to it, such that if you were not to have it, you couldn't be happy. So that's an unhealthy kind of enjoyment. Whereas the healthy feelings, which come from true judgments, include joy, caution, and wish. Now you notice how they're they're overly defining these words to be a lot more specific than how we use them in everyday life. So let's contrast them together. Joy with delight. What's the difference between joy and delight? Well, as we use in the Stoic lexicon, if we're speaking that language, then joy means a kind of pleasantness that comes out of being wise, which for the Stoics includes being compassionate, being virtuous, and so forth. Whereas delight comes about because of those misjudgments you're making, like, oh, this is so great and I could never be happy without this thing. Meanwhile, let's look at the difference between wish and greed. So you might say, let's say you're trying to be healthier and you're going to have less sweets. And so you might simultaneously wish not to have the donut. I do not wish to have a donut, but I do desire to have the donut. And what that means is that the rational part of you has decided that it is not time for a donut, but the underlying, lizard brain, or the unrestrained, passionate part of you, the instinctive, emotional part of you, is desiring the donut. So these two things can happen simultaneously. The desire, the lust, the greed is not healthy because it's based on little judgments you're making that the donut is beneficial when it truly isn't. And the wish not to have the donut is based on true judgments. And so that's why the feeling of wish is where you get your impetus to act. I wish for the child not to drown in the pool, so I'll jump in and save the child, so on and so forth. So the same with caution and fear. The difference between caution and fear. Caution is rational, and fear is irrational. It's not necessarily based on the particulars or the facts. It's just an impulse based on the judgment that you need to retract and retreat. And so this is how the Stoics draw the distinction between these two and how they understand why they emerge. If we know that healthy feelings come from true judgments and unhealthy feelings come from false judgments, then how do we know the good from the bad? What is true and what is false? So we begin by realizing why it is that we have a label for good and bad. Why do we call things, when we judge them, why do we judge them good or bad? Well, think of that like a tool. There's a functionality to that. And the functionality is that it's important to delineate between good and bad so that you can take action to move towards something or away from it, to refrain from doing something or to do it, to pursue it or to reject it. That's why the judgment center is essential. Making good judgments is important. So what happens is, when we decide something is good or bad, and it's something that's outside of our control, something that we can do something about, we've literally made an error. We've malfunctioned. The judgment center has malfunctioned in a way because it's assigned a positive or negative value to something, and then there's no follow-up. Nothing can be done with that data. You can't then say, okay, now that I've assigned it as good, I can now act in this way. And if I assign it in bad, I act in that way. So with things that are outside of our control, there's nothing to be done about it. Therefore, the labeling of it as good and bad was irrelevant. There was no purpose to that function. So if we understand judgment in that way as a tool for a specific purpose, then it becomes clearer to see that we needn't make good and bad judgments about things outside of our control. So we need to have a framework for how we label these things. The Stoics reserved emotionally charged words for things that are within our control. And they use less emotionally charged words, more neutral words for things outside of our control. And by doing that, by using those labels, we begin to think about it in that way. Because emotional impetus is there to impart action. And if there's nothing to be done because it's outside of our control, you don't need the emotional response. So for those things, we use more neutral language. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take the concepts of virtue and vice. Virtue is when a person acts in accordance with their nature as a social being, as a moral, rational being, as the Stoics put it. If you act within the healthy nature of a moral, social, rational being, then you're acting compatibly with your design. And the natural result will be an easiness and a psychological well-being. That's virtue. Vice, as they defined it, is when we act in discord with that. When we follow some kind of misjudgment that leads to an impulse or a feeling, and we do that in opposition to what is healthy for a social animal and a rational animal. So these terms, virtue and vice, they don't have quite the sting that the label good and evil has. You say, that's evil, or, ooh, that's good. That's a more emotional kind of word than virtue and vice. Virtue and vice are categories. And so they use virtue and vice to talk about the actions of all rational beings. I can say my neighbor is virtuous and then use that as a way to follow their lead or be inspired. I can say my other neighbor is vicious, which is the word that means of or related to vice. And if they're vicious, then I know to beware them or to not follow that lead. But now, what about good and evil? The Stoics said that the only good is my virtuous choice. The only evil is my vicious choice. And you notice I didn't say your. So for me, from my perspective, the only good in the world is when I am virtuous, and the only evil in the world is when I'm vicious. The actions of other people are not good or evil, they're indifferent. They're like, if somebody comes and burns your house down, that's the same as if lightning strikes and burns your house down. It's all part of the logos. It's all part of the natural unfolding of the universe. There's going to be virtuous people and vicious people. Now, you do need to denote who's virtuous and who's vicious so that you can promote one and not promote the other and stay away from certain people and take heed of other people. We need to function in the world. But to use that word good for things that are not within my control, remember, the will is the only thing in my control. And to use the word evil for things that are not in my control, that's only going to lead to inspiring those misjudgments that result in unhealthy feelings. And so Luke asks Yoda, how am I to know the good from the bad? And Yoda says, you will know when you're calm and at peace. And what the Stoics say is that when we are free of misjudgments, when we are no longer clouded by misjudgment, then we'll be able to see clearly. And when we do, it will become intuitively apparent what is virtuous and what is vicious, and therefore which is the good way to go and the evil way to go. And so the Stoics work to see the unfolding of fate as per the logos, as not good or bad, but learn to accept and move with it. The Jedi call this the will of the Force. Experiencing and appreciating the moment while remaining conscious of the fact that it is impermanent. This is how Yoda, knowing he was soon to die on Dagobah, was able to say, "Twilight is upon me and soon night must fall. That is the way of things, the way of the Force." By comparing his own life and death to the rising and setting of the suns, he was telling us that he has already deeply integrated full knowledge and remembrance of the impermanent nature of the cosmos into his thinking, feeling, and expectations. It's kind of like nihilism in accepting all things must pass, but it isn't negative. Instead, there is an appreciation of not just the little impermanent moments, things, or people we cling to, but an appreciation for and seeing beauty and awe in that whole dynamic, ever-changing system. Another thing the Stoics are known for is their conception of cosmopolitanism. Now, the word cosmopolitan, when you break it down, really means a citizen of the cosmos. So in ancient Greece, everyone was a citizen of a city-state. You'd be an Athenian or a Spartan, so on and so forth. And so when asked, what are you a citizen of? They would say, I'm a citizen of the cosmos. That's what cosmopolitan means. And today we mean it to mean you move around a lot, you're a person of the world. But it had a much more spiritual kind of connotation then. And this is the Jedi conception of the symbiont circle, what Obi-Wan referred to in episode 1. He said, surely you must realize that you and the Naboo form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. Because the universe, and this is where we're coming back into physics again, the universe is one integrated, interdependent whole. And when we forget that, that's when we're in discord with the will of the Force. That's why selfishness is of the dark side and selflessness is of the light side. Not because of some goody two-shoes rule system being imposed, but simply because it is wise perception of reality, the reality of interconnectedness and the reality of interdependence. And so the Stoics call this oikeiosis. It's a process of appropriation, or what we might call expansion of the self to include others. Obi-Wan instructed Luke to reach out with his feelings. Imagine a circle with a series of concentric rings. The inner circle is the self. The one out from that is friends and family. The one out from that is neighbors. The one out from that is enemies, and then the whole universe. And so as we expand our sense of concern from self out further and further and further, we get a larger and larger and larger perspective that is more consistent with that interconnectedness. In other words, we begin to see the world as it is instead of our little egotistical perspective on it. And this is reaching out with your feelings, because then you will begin to have feeling responses when things affect other things the way you do when things affect you. Yoda said that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. This progression is very consistent, a good match for the Stoic conception of things. This is why the Stoics do not begin at the end and admonish people to not be hateful or to not be angry. Instead, they begin at the beginning, the root, where feelings begin and what causes those feelings to emerge. If you're bottling up feelings, if you're trying to control your emotions, control your anger, control your fear, control your greed or lust, if you're trying to do anything like that, you've already failed in the Stoic endeavor. So don't worry about bottling it up. That's just going to be unhealthy and unproductive. What you need to do is be mindful, honest, and open about your feelings. Nothing in contemplative practices that inspire the Jedi have to do with looking away or ignoring or burying or denying anything. It's about mindfulness, being aware of, looking directly at something. And so there's nothing to be ashamed of if you have feelings of whatever nature, but just simply be aware of them. Notice them. And as you notice them, they will start to lose their control. They will start to lose their impact because you'll start seeing them for what they are. You start at the beginning with perspectives and judgments. And then the healthy feelings will emerge naturally, and the unhealthy feelings will begin to diminish over time. This is if you keep a consistent practice, your Jedi training, so to speak. And so it's not about willpower, but about fundamentally reshaping the kind of being you are over time through reading, minding what you've learned, putting it into practice, and consistency of practice over time. And then you no longer need to try. You just do, as Yoda said. You simply begin reacting to the world in a more healthy way that is consistent with the true nature of things, or the nature of the Force. The Stoics call this walking in accord with nature, and the Jedi call it being one with the Force. Being one with the Force means to be a type of person that responds to the world as it really is. So if you'd like to learn more about Stoicism and include that as part of your Jedi training, I would recommend reading a lot more, continuing to read. I've put some references in the description that you could use as a springboard. I would also include mindfulness meditation as a regular practice. It doesn't have to be super long or especially inconveniencing, but the regularity of it could be important. I'll be making some videos about mindfulness meditation in the future. I would also include Stoic journaling. You can look into that. It's a kind of journaling where you reflect on your day and what progress you've made and what kinds of things you failed at, kind of a self-assessment we do on a regular basis. And then there's many other Stoic practices. One of them is negative visualization. Now that's kind of an advanced practice, but it's a kind of a contemplation that one can do on unfortunate possible events using your imagination. You don't want to do it if it's going to end up causing you to become distressed. But what you do is you do it kind of like a test to see where you're at. Start small. Start with minor things, like what if my favorite cup broke? How would I feel? How would I deal with that? What would I do? And that's kind of a way to go through the stages of grief ahead of time so that you're already prepared. You're already dealing with things and people you love with the full awareness and mindfulness of the transience of all things in a way that lets you appreciate the present moment, where you are now, without becoming distressed over the impermanent nature of things. And then also things like, kind of like Lent, where you have these moments of self-restraint. You try to go without sugar for a day, or you know, just different things, and you can customize that to your needs. That can kind of help you recalibrate your need for certain things or your desires. Do this reasonably, sparingly, with some intention, and don't get out of hand with it. You don't have to torture yourself or anything like that, but you can find that some of these practices can be helpful. And you can also look up many more practices about Stoicism using the references I provided in the description. And the last thing, of course, is so that you can keep an eye on the big picture of things, the long term, the big picture of the universe and the cosmos. Observe your narratives. Think about the stories you tell yourself, how you frame things, how you describe yourself and your situation and things that happen to you and the people that you run into. Really analyze that. Is that really true? Or are you being kind of biased in those stories? Thanks for joining me, and may the Force be with you.